Okay, now onto the chapter on education. There's some good stuff in here. The first thing I just want to reiterate the romantic view by Rousseau. Um, he really and he really provided the idea that we should consider who we're educating. That we have this view from Locke that to civilize a child, to make them into an adult, we just need them to go through adult things. We need them to look at adult things. But the Rousseauian idea was to look at, pay more attention to, how the child is already and what they come with, and not to simply treat them as an object to be filled, but to consider also their own needs and interests while they're children, which would not have been at all considered worth any time at all or any value in the past. Right? Childish things. What are childish things? They're useless things, right? It doesn't matter. That's where that meaning comes from. But the Rousseauian idea is to respect children as they are, not treat them as objects, and to, in some cases, empower them when they are as they are. Now, where Rousseau takes this into a radical form is when he suggests that children have a wisdom that adults lack. And that's what you can connect with modern social justice warrior stuff. You have some of the least educated and immature people that are expected to solve human problems, solve social problems. I even have seen, I can't remember if it was an award, it was something beyond just a classroom, it was some award, or it was something regarded by a society or something. I think it was an award or some kind of competition where they had like grade 5 kids providing some kind of essay contest or project contest or fair or something. They were providing answers to every year. I guess there was some question, some social problem like climate change or whatever. And these grade 5s were expected to provide a creative answer to these problems, or warfare or starvation or any kind of social problem you can name. And it was believed that these kids could possibly provide these answers, which I think what an amazing slight against people who are paid to do this. Like all the experts, and I guess people in universities, but also people in, I guess it depends on the issue, but let's say warfare. So you've got all kinds of generals and analysts and all kinds of people who are commenting on these things, and yet they also have to contend and compete with grade 5s, saying what they think about it. Like, I think it's hilarious, but it is based on the idea that children should be empowered, and them being children, them being immature and lacking experience could be a virtue. That's the insidious, that's the essential idea right there. Is that, and it's Rousseauian idea that adults are corrupt. Adults have seen too much. All adults are shell-shocked. And children who are innocent and pure and angelic, they have the key to solving our problems. Because they're not corrupted by money and power and prestige and all the vices you could think of. They hold the key. The children hold the key. And you probably could think of a bunch of movies where the children are the winners and the adults are bad. Like I think of The Goonies, which is a fairly old movie. Well, not that old. But The Goonies is where the kids are the heroes and the adults are pretty much all bad. They're all evil and corrupt and greedy. And I'm sure there's lots of movies you can name where, even like Home Alone, where most of the adults are either jerks or thieves or Even his family isn't very nice, but he's the pure kid. But anyways, there's all kinds of romanticism with children, right? And that idea comes from Rousseau, and maybe elsewhere, but I think it was captured well with Rousseau, that children are something unique, and we should respect children as they are and not treat them as immature adults. That they have something, like the weakest case is to say that let them be kids and have fun. Like that's the weak, fairly complacent case for leaving children alone. But the strong case is the Rousseau case, is that, oh no, children are superior human beings, and anything you do to children will actually be at their detriment. So that's where that comes from. And Postman talks more about this on page 160. He says that he talks about education as a natural resource, and well, for the longest time it was believed that an ignorant populace was a good thing because it's easier to rule over an ignorant populace. But then eventually, I guess starting with Prussia, they had compulsory school laws and state schooling, and they provided a narrative for their citizens. Now this grew eventually into the idea that we educate the populace for economic reasons, and we need an educated population to compete with other nations economically. And by educated, we don't mean like literate necessarily. We just mean that they can work in factories and all that. They're not just sitting at home being farmers. But then eventually, of course, we have the literate society, and we have this idea that education actually should be to maintain democracy. We need an educated population to be able to vote and have political power responsibly, to use it responsibly. But what has been the opposing view of this later idea is that if we make our kids literate, and if we empower those kids and giving them courses on such as critical thinking, they might reject the traditional views. Who wants their children to change their country? Who wants their parents? What parents want their children to change their home? And no one does, right? They can make their own home, but they're not going to change the home that I have. And so there's always been this opposition from parents and from the status quo, is that if we empower kids and give them critical thinking, we're necessarily setting ourselves up to be criticized and for them to take over and change everything. And this is not only dangerous to the nation state, but it may be dangerous to the home. And if kids are bringing home information that may criticize their parents, then parents get mad, right? And you can also see this in like sex education curriculum. If children are bringing home ideas and knowledge that they shouldn't have, or the parents don't think they should have, that also gets parents annoyed. So this is like these are factors that compete with each other. One thing that Postman suggests that he wishes this to be implemented to make the education system better is he says that why don't we actually teach children something about the art and science of asking questions? This is on page 161. And he says that, is it not curious then that the most significant intellectual skill available to human beings is not taught in school? And he says that there may be those who can remember some teacher spending a day or two, or maybe even a week, on the subject of how to ask questions, of what kinds of different questions there are, of how different subjects are characterized by different questions, of the relationship between the questions we ask and the answers we get. But I doubt that there is anyone who could say that any of this was taught in a sustained and systematic way in school. There's no doubt about that. Critical thinking, of course, are supposed to do that. But often critical thinking is a program that is supposed to alter all curriculum. It's not something taught on its own. It is just supposed to be some kind of implicit framework of what's taught. And so he provides some examples on the next page. On 162, he says, what would happen if a student studying history asks, whose history is this? What will happen if a student, having been given a definition, asks, who made this definition? Are there other ways to define this thing? What would happen if a student, being given a set of facts, asks, what is a fact? How is it different from an opinion? And who is the judge? What happens, of course, is that students not only learn history, definitions, and facts, but also learn where these things come from and why. And what he criticizes is that because students don't typically ask these questions, we are producing students who are answer givers, not question askers. And I think Postman might also be saying that this contributes to a culture of a tribal culture where you just indoctrinate kids with answers, and then they emerge with these ideas in mind and never questioning them, and when they meet someone who disagrees, they can't have a rational discussion. The other thing which Postman doesn't discuss, which is really a remark of mine, is that, first of all, how early can you go with critical thinking? That's the one thing. Are you going to teach logic to grade, like how elementary school? How early can you really go and be effective with critical thinking? The other thing is that skepticism, if taught early, I think produces nihilists. If you tell students that, I think history is a good example. So we're teaching history, and we're teaching about, I don't know, Declaration of Independence or the Civil War or something in the States. And some student asks, well, this is just the perspective of the winners of the Civil War. This isn't the perspective of the South. This is the perspective of the North, because they're the victors. And they have this discussion, and then it becomes, well, this is just an opinion. How do we know this is true about history? But I think what it does is that it eventually it degrades to, well, what does it matter? How do we know this is true at all? Is this not just a biased history or a one-sided history? Who can know anything? And why does it matter? And isn't it just an opinion? If that becomes the final end of this discussion, then you have created a nihilist. You have created a person they're not able to attach themselves to anything. And all they have uncovered is slippery ideas and skepticism as an absolute. Now, what is the common solution? The common solution is a narrative, which I disagree that has to be the solution, because this narrative, of course, is going to be this finely crafted myth of a history or whatever. And I don't agree that has to be the solution. I think you can have a rational discussion and in history and provide you can provide perspectives, but ultimately something happened. Ultimately something happened in history, and is the purpose of the historians is to discover what that is by looking at documents and vetting sources and trying to vet any distortions in the documents. And history eventually does have an answer. It just has to be found. And I think losing that perspective into one of how can we know and what sources can we trust, and I don't think that has to be how it ends up, because like I said, it just creates nihilism. You create people who no longer look for answers because they don't think they can ever find it. On page 164, he suggests that we should be teaching about language and what it does. He says here, we need a serious attempt at language study. He says that is key. It must begin with the idea that words are not only tools to think with, but also, for all practical purposes, the content of our thoughts. I'm not implying that the world consists only of words. That is to say, I'm not a modern French philosopher. I am saying that whatever meanings we give to the world, what sense we make of things, derive from our power to name, to create vocabularies. I think that this is important because I think that when we get over this soon, fairly soon, I think, transition point, this tipping point, I guess, it may be necessary to create new words to convey new ideas. Even the idea of like liberal, for example. The modern liberal is someone who is not liberal. Liberal is supposed to mean freedom, and modern liberals, all they suggest is anti-freedoms. They suggest controls. The classical liberal was an actual liberal, someone who is supposed to free a person. We may need a new word to convey that idea because that idea has been bastardized. It's been destroyed. We may need a new word, and eventually that word will probably be distorted and destroyed, and we may need to create another word. Conservative has also been distorted. It's funny, conservatives used to be monarchists, essentially. They used to be people who wanted to impose controls on people, tell people how to live and be politically correct and what language, what words to use for certain things, and lifestyle, and all kinds of controls. It used to be the conservative. The modern conservative is a person who's defending liberties, who's protecting their right to own weapons and free speech. And what a strange world to flip that over. That we've gone back in time. The classical conservative is now is now the modern liberal, a monarchist, and the classical liberal is now the modern conservative. What a weird, what a messed up world that we're in. Here's a really good point on page 166 on the same topic as I just mentioned. He says, these ideas that people create meanings by the names they use, and that we are free to reject the names they are given, whether in the realm of politics, commerce, or religion, are central to language education, and are one's principal source of defense against a culture in which propaganda is the largest industry. So he's saying here is that we can reject the words people use and ask for definitions and define things differently. We do not have to be a slave to these slogans and memes and all kinds of sound bites and nonsense like that. Another recommendation to the school system on 168, he says that what we really need to do in science is not so much teach, not so much whether this or that theory is to be believed. I guess he might be saying evolution or whatever. Not so much whether it's to be believed, but how scientists judge the merit of theory. So what is it based on? So a good example, I guess in the U.S. Primarily, is the idea of evolution versus intelligent design. We don't really need to tell students so much in the science classroom that they need to believe evolution. That's dogma, right? To say that you need to believe this. What they do need to be telling students is evolution is based on these things. Here's the evidence. Here are the bones. Here are the fossil fragments. Here are all the species that came before us and that led to this and led to this. It's better to teach the evidence. Let the students make up their own mind. Not just to say that evolution is scientific. And that you can use that with climate change as well. You can say, we don't need to, 97% of scientists, I don't care what 97% of scientists say. I always thought that was curious. What do the 3% say? But what's the evidence for these things? What are we basing these on? Are these all on computer modeling? Well, modeling is not accurate. What is the evidence? That's what they should be telling people, not 97% agree. That's nonsense. That's dogma. You don't care about what 97% people agree. At one time, 97% of scientists agree the world was flat. So it's nonsense. Show me the evidence. A further example, I think it's a good thing to mention here on the next page on 169, he says that we should not be teaching that, so we have Ptolemy's view of the universe, And then we have Copernican's view of the universe, of teaching science like this. That this guy was wrong and an idiot. Now we have Copernicus. He fixed a bunch of things. That's all. That's still its dogma. That's teaching kids to learn things by authoritarianism. That just because my teacher or my textbook said so. That's a wrong way to teach science. We should be teaching what Ptolemy's evidence was. What did Ptolemy base his theories on? What did he see the world as? Right? And that's why he led. How did he lead to his conclusions? In a sense, we should be having a day on Ptolemy and making all the students, well, sort of making them, but make them all Ptolemists for a day. This is the worldview. This is all the evidence Ptolemy had. So of course you would have to believe what Ptolemy had to say, unless you, of course, you can criticize it, even just based on Ptolemy's evidence. Maybe you can criticize him. And then having another day on Copernicus did this stuff, and he saw this through his telescope and whatever, and he had this kind of model of the universe. And what Postman suggests is that being able to think through these various worldviews and what evidence they had is a far superior than simply suggesting that, well, Ptolemy had this view, but he's an idiot, and now Copernicus had his view, but now he's an idiot, and then Newton comes along, right, and blah blah blah, or Kepler, and then at least you're having students engage with the ideas and showing the evidence and make them more centered on what the evidence was, as opposed to just science as a discipline of giants in which you just learn which one is standing on which one, and that's all you need to know. He also thinks that this might be doomed because teachers have very little knowledge of either the history of science or the philosophy of science, and I can attest to that. My undergraduate was chemistry, and we did not learn about any history of science or any philosophy of science. I don't even think they were offered, because if they were, I would have taken them as electives, but they were not offered. So no wonder the science teachers won't be able to do this anyways. And just one more point as the final point for the chapter on education. He says that, well, we haven't. He also suggests that we should have what's called technology education, and that we should be discussing with students. I'm not sure how young he wants to go. Maybe in high school would be the best time. But he would suggest that it's nice to tell people what technology comes from, or how it works, how the telescope works, or how the computer works. But it may be even more important to have a course and discussion with students about the consequences of technology, such as he says here. Automobiles to movies to television. What are the psychological, social, and political effects of new technologies? That might be a more relevant course or discussion to be having with students, because they're the ones that are going to have to brunt these changes. It's too myopic now to tell what these consequences will be, such as for the cell phone or whatever other technology you want. Internet. I've been the internet for a bit. I guess my lifetime pretty much, since the 80s. But I think it may be important for students to discuss these ideas in high school, because, like I said, they're the ones that are going to have to deal with these changes. And if they're going to be part of the political power, then they need to be able to work out any problems that might arise from these technological changes. And of course, in the theme of this book, I think has been, and I'm at the end here now, there's a bunch of appendices and stuff, but the important point is that there needs to be an increasingly discussion of the purpose of all these things and what we're going to do, because we can't just keep getting better nukes. Like, you want a nuke that can nuke a city, and now you have a nuke that can nuke a country, and now you have a nuke that can just destroy the planet. Like that can't. There's no good end to that. There's no good. We can't just keep getting. We have like satellite lasers and EMP, and oh my God, we can't just increasing the deadliness of our weapons without having a discussion about what they should be used for, and why should those things not be connected? Why should we have students taking courses in material sciences and rocketry and things like that, and not also be taking a course in warfare ethics or something like that? We have to reconnect, I think. I think maybe this is the final point. We have to reconnect the normative and the descriptive. We have to reconnect what we ought to do with ourselves and our technology. We have to connect that with the physical sciences and the world and our technologies and all of that, our innovation. It may be an even more difficult question. We seem to be able to invent new things and have a great capacity for innovativeness, but we really need a capacity also to make decisions about how they're to be used. And policy research is often a boring topic, but within policy is an implicit framework of how these things are used, and it's needed. It has to be done. If we're not following a code of laws of Hammurabi or some other religious document, we need to invent a secular ethics, and it has to be done. And I think obviously it can be sourced in education, but it can be sourced other places, but it has to be done. I think the strong message of the book is that the normative must come back, and we can no longer rely on narratives from religion. That's going away, and should not trust governments and states to make these things either. That has to be part of our common experience. Has to be all in our minds. What's to be done about these things.